Hello and welcome to Apple Core. I'm Graham Bauer, a designer, writer, and longtime Apple user.
And I'm Charlie Sorrell, also a longtime Apple user, and I've been writing about Apple and other technology for a long time now.
Apple Core is a podcast about Apple history. In each episode, we look at a different Apple product because if you want to anticipate what Cupertino is going to do next, you need to understand how the company has tackled similar problems in the past. And it's one such problem we're going to look at today. And so, Charlie, I have a teaser for you. I'm a place in California, but before that, I was a big cat. And long before that, I was a famous American composer. What am I?
Are you Mac OS?
I am
10?
Mac OS. Yeah. Anyway, so Charlie, cast your mind back to 1997. What were you doing in 1997?
What was I doing? Probably running a bar, working in a restaurant, something like that.
Okay. Were you using Macs back then?
I wasn't. At that point, I was not really doing much computing at all. If I did have a computer, it was an Amiga. I just still have mine.
You still have your Amiga. Yeah, okay. So 1997, to set the scene, Men in Black was a box office sensation, and the Backstreet Boys had just released As Long As You Love Me. And it was an important year for Apple as well, because it was the year that they released Mac OS 8. So, Charlie, what do you know about Mac OS 8?
Not much. I know that it came before Mac OS 9, which was the first. Well,
it did. It came after Mac OS 7 as well.
But no, OS 9 was the first one I used because it came on my first Mac, which was the plastic iBook, and it came with Mac OS 9, and also you could boot into Mac OS 10. I'm not sure if I installed that or if it came as part of it.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time, you used to be knocking back into Classic, which was OS 9.
That sounds right.
Yeah. So all I know I've never used Mac OS 8.
Okay, so to put this in a context of why I find Mac OS 8 so interesting and worth going back to is I think a lot of the things that Steve Jobs did with Mac OS 8 really kind of reveal some of the game plan of how Apple thinks about its system software, how it plans in the short term and the long term, and how it handles these transitions from one major platform to another. And this is something which I think Apple is universally recognized to be very good at. Can you think of some of the other amazing platform transitions that Apple has masterfully achieved?
They went from, PowerPC to Intel, from Intel to Apple Silicon.
Yeah. And from 68K to PowerPC. And I mean, other things like the transition to 64-bit as well. Almost every time Apple does one of these big transitions, you hardly notice. So I think this is something that Apple is very good at. I wanted to look at the transition from the classic Mac OS to Mac OS 10 and the role that the humble Mac OS 8 played in that transition. This was maybe one of the most painful transitions in Apple's history. So what is this transition that we're talking about? Well, Mac OS 10, sometimes called OS 10, written as an X, is actually, to this day, the underpinnings of all Apple's platforms. Everything from iPhone, Apple TV, Apple Watch, Vision OS, all these things are actually based upon Mac OS 10. And Mac OS 10 is a product that Apple started working on around 1997 when Apple bought Steve Jobs' company Next and chose NeXTSTEP as the successor to Mac OS. So that was very much the game plan that Steve Jobs brought to Apple when he came back for his second stint at the company. His operating system, NeXTSTEP, would be really the future of the Mac platform. And he felt that so strongly that, in fact, in the first years of his leadership of Apple, he didn't have a Mac on his desktop. He actually used one of his Next machines. Steve Jobs himself refused to use Apple products back then. And even
That's such a Jobs move, though.
It is a Jobs move. I think it was supposed to humble people. It was supposed to kind of really tell the team in Cupertino that they needed to get their act together so that they put out an OS that was good enough for their CEO to use. So he was using NeXTSTEP even when Mac OS 8 came out. Really, the first smart product to come out of the new era of Steve Jobs was Mac OS 8. It still wasn't smart enough to go on his desktop, but it was exactly the right move at the right time. So, in that sense, this was the start of one of the most successful runs in business history of Steve Jobs' second era at Apple, that I thought it was really worth zooming in on macOS 8. And what does it tell us about the way that Apple thinks about platforms? Even though Steve Jobs refused to put it on his own desktop machine, it was a smash hit. In fact, it was the biggest selling Apple software product of all time. They sold 1.2 million copies in the first 2 weeks of sale.
Oh, wow.
And Steve Jobs proudly announced that at Macworld Expo in Boston. What also seems hard to believe now, when I say it's best-selling, is that this was sold in retail channels, a boxed copy, and it cost $99. It's pretty amazing to think about now. Software like this continued to be shipped on CD-ROMs and DVD-ROMs for many years after, and Apple continued charging updates. And do you know, Charlie, can you guess, what was the last version of macOS that Apple charged for, and when would that be?
Was it Lion? And around, I think it was after the iPhone came out, no? Because then they realized that you should keep people updating. So probably around 2009 or 10.
2013 with macOS 10.9.
Really, that long?
Yeah.
And which one was that? Which cat was that?
Mavericks.
I remember Mavericks. Wow. So it wasn't even a cat.
Yeah, we've moved on from cats.
I remember I was invited to a launch in the Regent Street Apple store.
Oh yeah.
It was like a press thing for one of the cats. And I went along and they were doing a presentation of, what the new features were. And I already had it running on my machine because a flatmate who worked for Macworld magazine had managed to get an early copy of it. And so I was sitting there and they were like reading out what the bits and pieces were, and I was taking notes in that operating system that they were launching.
You were smugly taking notes in that operating system.
Yeah, I was. And I was like hoping that the person next to me would notice. But I was also very happy at these things because they would give you a copy of the operating system, and that was, I think at that point it was like £129 or dollars, depending on where you were. So that was quite a saving. Yeah.
Well, at the time, certainly if you go back to the 90s, then system software was one of the most profitable parts of the business. System software is how Bill Gates made his fortune, right? Mm-hmm. These days, obviously, Microsoft makes money with Azure and all of this other stuff. But back in the day, Microsoft made all its money with system software. And so it didn't seem so strange that Apple was making a fortune on system software. And I suppose now, we think about stuff like Android, and people tend to give system software away for free. But back then, it was a really high margin, high value business.
But Windows is still charging, though. I mean, Windows still charges the PVMac piece, because if you buy a version without Windows on it, if you buy a PC laptop without an operating system on it, it still comes cheaper. So it's Apple and Android that and Apple doesn't really give it away, because they don't give it away to anyone. You just get it when you pay them lots of money for your computer.
It's an interesting aside. And I did look at the breakdown of Microsoft's revenue from last year, and I think they actually make more money from Office now than they do from Windows. And they certainly make more money from cloud services. So although they still charge for Windows, it's a much, much smaller part of their income, whereas back in the 90s, it was the main event. So that puts a context to Apple charging $99 for macOS 8. It would seem extortionate now, but at the time, people expected to pay big bucks for operating systems, and people have been waiting a long time for macOS 8, because we, at this point, have been waiting 6 years for a software update. Right? We've been using System 7 for so long, and it was so out of date. And finally, we had a new operating system. It wasn't good enough for Steve Jobs himself, but for the rest of us, it was a big, big step forward.
Let me just interrupt you there?
Please do.
I'm sending you a picture of macOS 8. Okay, let me describe it. It's a white box, but the main picture is like a red square with a white 8 circles in the middle of the two 8s. There's a world at the bottom, like a globe, a planet, a blue planet, and then above that, there's just the eyes, nose and mouth of somebody smiling. They're looking very happy.
Well, I like that. I really remember that 8. I think it's hard sometimes to take graphics out of their era. The way in which that 8 was done was unusual typographically. It was quite striking at the time. It maybe doesn't look so striking now. Just the idea of having a giant number as the graphic, which they carried on into 9 and then macOS 10 with the giant X. For the time, it was a very bold and dramatic piece of graphic design. So what do you know, Charlie, about Copeland?
I do know something about it. I know that it never made it.
Yeah, that's the most important thing to know, yeah.
Yeah. It was supposed to be, their next generation operating system that they just kept working on, and then they never did it in the end.
Yeah. Exactly right. Yeah. So it's quite shocking. This story. It's a shocking story of business failure. After Steve Jobs had departed, he'd left the company with the Mac, and the Mac was really his last creation before he was booted out of Apple unceremoniously in the late 80s. And at that point, the Mac was a good product, but it had some issues with it. The original kind of classic Mac that Steve Jobs had created was low powered and very expensive. And so it wasn't really until a few years later that the Mac started to take off. In fact, one stat that I found that was interesting was a year after the Mac had come out, 85% of Apple's hardware sales still came from Apple II, which was its gangbusters selling computer at the time. So the Mac didn't do particularly well to begin with. And after Steve Jobs' departure, they introduced more highly powered machines, and it coincided with the desktop publishing revolution. So this graphical user interface that Steve Jobs had been so proud of found a purpose. And that was, at the time they used this term called WYSIWYG. Do you remember WYSIWYG?
What you see is what you get.
Exactly. Yeah. So This so much goes without saying now that it's strange to think about. But the remarkable thing about the Mac back then was you could look at a document on screen and it would look the same when you printed it out. And this was new. It was a whole new concept, and it ushered in the era of desktop publishing, that you could finally start designing documents on screen with a computer and print them out, and they would look just the same as they did on screen. And so the publisher...
If only that was still the case now. If only my printer could print what I've got on my screen.
Well, Macs had really started making inroads into the publishing industry with these higher-end workstation systems and software like Aldus PageMaker and Quark Express and Photoshop that were enabling people to edit photos and lay out page designs on their Macs. And this was something that you couldn't initially do in Windows. And so Mac had a head start. But as the years progressed and we get to around 1988, the macOS architecture was already starting to look dated. These days, if I say multitasking, then lots of iPad fans will get really angry about how they can't do all the things that they want to do with split screens. But from a more of an underlying technology perspective, iPad is very much a multitasking operating system, but macOS back then was not. With the kind of first world problems of iPad users today, the Mac back then, if you copied a file in the Finder would lock up and you could not use the Finder until it finished copying. You could only do one thing at a time, and you couldn't do the next thing until it had finished doing the last thing.
Also, wasn't there a program that you could use? It was called like Multifinder.
Multifinder, I think, came with System 6. What Apple introduced with System 6 and then a bit more with System 7 was this thing called cooperative multitasking. Mm-hmm. And so this would be one task would tell the system when it was finished, and then another task was allowed to take over. But that meant you were reliant on all the tasks not crashing. If something went wrong with one task, it could hang the whole system. Whereas modern operating systems, the operating system itself is dividing the system resources between all the different threads. Apple could see this looming threat from Microsoft. They were not standing still. MS-DOS was joined soon by what became Windows NT, which was a much more modern operating system. So they knew they needed to move the macOS forward fast. And so legend has it that in 1988, Apple engineers had this off-site meeting where they wrote all their ideas for how they wanted to improve the Mac system software down on these cards. And the cards are in 3 different colors, blue, pink, and red. So the short-term ideas of like quick wins, things we could do right now that would make it a bit better, they put those on blue cards. And then the sort of mid-term ideas of things that we really should do, but they're going to take a bit more work, they put them onto pink cards. And then the long-term ideas, which were like, would be awesome, but it's really never going to happen, they put them onto red cards. And then they focused on the first two, the blue and the pink cards, and they divided into 2 teams, the blue team and the pink team, who were going to work in parallel, which was not a bad idea, but it didn't work out so well. What we had was the blue team delivered System 7. System 7 was a big improvement. It had the multi-threaded Finder that we touched on, but it didn't have full multitasking, and it didn't have memory protection. So that meant that if one app went a bit screwy, it could write over another app's memory and crash the whole system. And so System 7 did crash very often. It was the thing people used to say back then was save as you go. You had to remember to keep saving your files because it was really only a matter of time before your Mac was going to crash and you had to restart it.
I still hit Command S all the time, even though I don't need to. It's just a habit.
I remember seeing a kernel panic on my Mac 2 years ago or something. This is the last time my Mac crashed. It really is so exceptionally rare now.
I get them when I plug things into it. Otherwise, I don't.
Yeah.
And one of my... talking about Command S, one of my favorite apps, Ulysses, the text editor, has repurposed the save because you don't need to save anything. It keeps everything in its own library. Although anyway, it keeps everything in its own library. So what it does is when you hit Command S, it saves a version instead. So it's kind of handy. So if you've got you think, okay, I like it now, then you can save and then you can always go back to it in the future. Kind of like a saving in a game, I guess.
Like a what do you call it? A something point. I can't remember the term now.
A save point. Save point in a game.
Save point, right? Yes. Okay, right. So we have the blue team and the pink team. And the blue team delivers with System 7. It was exactly what was needed. It was a step forward. And it would have been fine if the pink team was then going to deliver shortly afterwards, but they didn't. Mm-hmm. As it turns out, System 7 is what we're stuck with for 6 whole years, which is just insane when you think now we're so used to macOS being updated every year without fail. It's just like, imagine it's 6 years. It's an eternity with no update to macOS.
It's like waiting for a new Guns N' Roses album.
How long have you been waiting for one of those?
Well, I haven't, but it was a long time. And then they came out with Chinese Democracy and it was terrible. I don't know. I was trying to think of a more modern example. This
was a long wait. Anyway, so Team Blue, big tick, success. They moved the Mac forward with System 7. It was incremental. It helped to stave off what seemed like the inevitable, which was that macOS was doomed. Apple knew that Windows 95 was coming. Microsoft had not been shy about bragging about what they were working on. And I remember back then that there was so much excitement about Windows 95. And, I think when it had its retail release, I think it launched at midnight and people were queuing outside like the Virgin Megastore in Times Square in New York and stuff. The excitement, or was it CompUSA? Probably both. Around the world, people were just mad excited about Windows 95. And this is something the Apple team and the Mac team at Apple have been dreading, because rather than the GUI being a shell on top of DOS, with Windows 95, it was much more integrated and it looked way slicker. At this point, Microsoft had stolen all the best bits of the macOS UI, which, Apple had stolen from Xerox PARC in turn. Microsoft had done a lot of learning, a lot of finessing, and Windows 95 was great. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was it had this slightly 3D user interface. Everything was grey, but then there were kind of shadows and highlights around the boxes and buttons that made them all look like they were sticking out slightly. And that did not compare well to the Mac UI at the time. I don't know if you remember, but the Mac at the time was still just black and white. So all the buttons were just like black rectangles and everything was flat. And it's quite funny because today flat is like...
It's cool.
Is cool and in vogue. But back then, 3D was the new thing and Microsoft had it first. And, that I remember at the time, it's still like, well, okay, the Windows 95 user interface looked a bit slicker than Apple's 1-bit black and white UI, but you could still say that the design of System 7 in many respects was more elegant and more stylish, better laid out and better thought through.
Yeah, I'm looking at a picture of it now and I really like it. Yeah, I would like it if my Mac looked like this now. It's clean and easy to see where everything is. Easy to read.
It was beautifully designed, but and you could even make that argument in 95, but by 1997 it looked really dated. Anyway, coming back to the pink team. All this time the pink team was supposed to be working on the next generation operating system, and that their plan had been to get this out before Windows 95, but they failed. There was a lot going on with the pink team. It got spun off from Apple and it was set up as a joint venture with IBM that was called Taligent. Do you know what Taligent stood for? It's a portmanteau word.
Yeah, talent. Talent agent. Was it a secret team of eagles?
No. Talent and intelligence, which in retrospect was really unfortunate given that this team actually never delivered any operating system ever. And a few years later, IBM had to shut the project down. So the failure of the Pink team was the start of the downfall of Apple. You know, at the point at which Steve Jobs came back in 1997, Apple had almost gone bust and could very well have gone bust. It was really the failure of Pink that set Apple on a downward spiral because they had no answer to Windows 95. And then swooning from that first blow, a year or so later, Windows NT came out. When Windows NT came out, the writing was on the wall for the Mac. This was a modern operating system. It didn't crash. It was multi-user. It was multitasking. It had memory protection. It had everything you want in a modern operating system. In the design industry, everyone was moving across to Windows NT at that point. When Apple realized that Pink was going nowhere, they came up with another next generation operating system. And this was called Copeland. What both Pink and Copeland have in common is something called second system syndrome. Have you heard of that?
No.
Have you heard of the sophomore slump?
Yeah, I have. Or the difficult second album.
Yes, exactly. So tell me about that.
Well, it's what you spend your entire life working on your first album.
As a musician.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then you hit it big. And then everybody expects a second album, and you've got 5 minutes to do it because you've got to come out with it soon, and you've got you don't know what you're doing really. Also, you're trying to live up to what you did before.
Yeah,
so it's very different.
Yeah, and I think that second system syndrome is the tech equivalent of the sophomore slump. That basically you knock it out of the park with like System 1, and everyone loves it, and it's great. So then, you're working on a successor to this, like the new version, and you want it to be everything that first fantastic one was, and so much more. And as a result, you're so ambitious that you screw up and fail. And that happened with Pink, and it happened with Copeland as well. And I think there's something interesting here, which is the Death March project in the 1990s. Big companies were still learning how to do big software projects because this was new. No one had done it before, like projects on this scale with this level of complexity. Microsoft turned out to be pretty good at it, and Apple turned out to be really very bad at it at the time. And they were not alone because lots of the industry was struggling with this. And the approach that the industry used to take was something called waterfall. Have you heard of that?
No, but it sounds ominous.
Okay. So the principle of a waterfall project is that you specify upfront everything that the project is going to do. It should do this, this, and this, and it sort of cascades down in stages. So you have the original spec, and then you do the designs, and then you do the build, and then you do the testing, and then you ship the project. And it turns out it's really, really hard for developers to work in that way. And it's really hard for project managers to work in that way. And one of the things that goes wrong with this is it takes so long to get down the waterfall that by the time you've finished, if you ever do, the requirements has changed. So then you get this thing of spec creep coming in. It's like, oh, we don't need this anymore, we need that. And then, okay, so then the developers are quickly taking on board those changes, but that's kind of setting them back again. What you realize is as you're moving forwards, you're actually moving backwards because the window where you're trying to get to is like rapidly moving away. It basically doesn't work. And what happened in the late 90s and into the aughts was these new project management methodologies. They were largely inspired by the Toyota production system, like Japanese manufacturing in the 1990s and the aughts. And a lot of these ideas came into software development in Silicon Valley, and they introduced agile software development and the Scrum methodology. And basically the industry got much smarter about how to break down these things into smaller chunks, how to bring things to market much faster and learn. So don't build loads of features that you think you're going to need. Do what's now called like a minimum viable product or an MVP, and get that to market as quickly as possible so you can get user feedback and then learn from there. So I think the mistake that Apple made with both Pink and Copeland was that they were so ambitious in their goals and they wanted to go so much further than what macOS currently did that they were really never going to be able to ship this thing because it was too ambitious. If anything, they would have been better off, as Steve Jobs did with macOS 10, to accept that the first version of macOS 10 wasn't a full replacement for macOS 9. It was better in a lot of respects, but it didn't have all the features that macOS 9 had, and some of those things had to be added later. for years, Apple went on about Copeland. They kept showing us the beautiful user interface of Copeland, which was called Platinum. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I had after some years afterwards on Mac OS 10, I had I themed my my desktop with a bunch of Copeland icons and and Platinum bits and pieces.
So yeah, and Platinum was basically taking everything that was nice about the Mac OS user interface and making it 3D like Windows 95. So it had a grey color to it, but it was a slightly nicer grey color than Windows 95's grey, and it had all the shadows and highlights and all of that, and it looked brilliant. But we couldn't have it. We couldn't have this on our Macs, and for years they were showing us what the future of the Mac would be, and the future never arrived. And that brings us up to when Gil Amelio, the CEO of Apple at the time, finally acknowledged that they screwed up with Copeland as well. It wasn't going to happen. They needed to buy an operating system off the shelf as the future for the Mac. And fatefully, the one that they chose to buy was NeXTSTEP, which was developed by Next, Steve Jobs' company. And this, in 1996, in December 1996, is what brought Steve Jobs back to Apple. Now, initially, he was an advisor to Gil Amelio, and I think Amelio only stepped down in the summer of 1997, and then it was in the fall of 1997 that Mac OS 8 came out. So I think, to be fair to Gil Amelio, he was probably involved in the planning stages of Mac OS 8 as well. But at that time, from 1996, when Steve Jobs came back, he was like special advisor to Gil Amelio, and everyone at the company was petrified of Steve Jobs because they knew he wanted to change everything, and they knew he thought they were all bozos. So he was already kind of campaigning for his team from former executives at Next to really take over in all the key positions in Apple, which they basically did. But the thing was, we Mac fans have been struggling with System 7 for 6 years now, and the purchase of NeXTSTEP gave Apple a way forward, which would become Mac OS 10. But realistically, that was going to be another 3 years. It wasn't until 2001 that the first version of Mac OS 10 came out, which would mean that we've been stuck with System 7 for a decade, and that just wasn't going to fly. And so what Steve Jobs did was basically exactly the same thing that happened a decade prior with this blue team and pink team. But this time, the pink team was the team working on Mac OS 10, and the blue team was the team that was working on Mac OS 8. Mac OS 8, what it was basically System 7 still. They didn't really address a lot of the technological problems under the hood because they couldn't. That would all come eventually with Mac OS 10. Steve Jobs picked apart the corpse of Copeland like a vulture, taking the good bits of Copeland that could be retrofitted into System 7. It was a pretty smart move. So one of those things was the Platinum user interface. That every Mac user had wanted to use this, but we couldn't because, they never released Copeland. Well, Steve Jobs' simple idea was, let's make System 7 look like Copeland and call it System 8.
There you go.
And
genius.
I think it is genius. We wanted it. It was something. That I think that is what really kind of got everyone excited that finally Mac OS is moving forward. And what I would say is Steve Jobs came back and finally Apple was doing stuff again. It shipped a new version of macOS. There was so much pent up for demand for it. They sold 1.2 million copies in 2 weeks. And, so what else did it have? The Platinum UI. I would say I had been using the Platinum UI before that because there were all these hack things that you could do. I don't know if you remember, you could customize macOS all kinds of different ways. And there was a plugin that I think I got from a floppy disk that was glued to the front of Mac User that unofficially did a sort of rip-off of the Platinum user interface that you could run on System 7. So I'd been using that for a while, and I know in my studio that was quite popular with a lot of people, and was probably one of the reasons why my Mac kept crashing as well. So, for that reason, finally we had an official way to have the Platinum UI on our Macs. It also finally introduced some core things. Do you remember the Mac had one mouse button and Windows had famously 2 mouse buttons? So you could right click on a PC, but you couldn't on a Mac. You could plug a 2-button mouse into your Mac, but the right clicking didn't make any difference. It was just a click. So like a really simple thing that they added with System 8 was that you could right click and get a context menu. Now it's sort of a double finger tap would be the gesture we use today, and that came with System 8. We had spring-loaded folders. This is another thing which you wouldn't really think about now, but you can drag an icon and hover over a folder, and that will open, and then you can sort of move it into a subfolder.
Yeah, I use that all the time.
Yeah,
I love it.
Yeah, without thinking, but that didn't exist. One that blows my mind now to think about it is live scrolling. Do you even know what live scrolling is? Because it so much goes without saying now.
Is it that as you scroll, the whatever you're scrolling on the screen moves?
Yeah.
Whereas before you'd scroll a bit and then wait, and when you stop scrolling, then it would update what you'd scrolled.
Yeah, it's a bit hard to describe it. I imagine that some younger listeners to this show won't understand what we're talking about. It's a bit hard to describe this.
They'll think we're winding them up.
Yeah, if you imagine if you scroll with a scroll bar, it doesn't move, but it's sort of like you see like a rectangle move instead. And then when you let go of the scroll bar, then it jumps to where you scrolled to.
Also, that would be the same with Windows. No, when you move a window across the screen,
that's right. Yeah, it would
stop updating it, and you just have the outline of the window, and then it would fill it in again when you let go of it.
When macOS 10 first came out, I remember it was one of the things I couldn't stop doing was just moving a window around the screen. I could see it as it moved, and it was like, whoa, it's so smooth.
Not only could you see it, but if there was something happening inside, like a video, it would keep playing.
Keep playing, yeah. Incredible. Yeah. And that actually, again, would be an example of something that Windows users had enjoyed since Windows 95. So at this point, when it's like 1997 and like 3 years have gone by and Windows users are totally used to live scrolling and stuff like this, for it to be like a cool new feature, it's like, it was dated even then. Window Shade was another popular plugin that you could get for your Mac. I don't think anyone does this anymore, but you could double click on the window bar and it would make the window disappear. So you just had like the Windows bar. No? Yeah.
I had a Haxi. Do you remember those? I had a Haxi in macOS 10, which would do that for you.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I can't remember the name of the company that did it. They did like lots of little system hacks like this that you could install, but I think they all used kernel extensions.
Yeah.
But yeah, it would do exactly that. It was very nice because you double click on the menu bar and then it would just be the menu bar. So you could have, and you can still do it actually if you use stickies. Sticky still does that. Yeah. So if you've never seen this in action, open up stickies, double click on the menu bar.
Try this now.
Of the title bar and you can see. Yeah. Oh yeah. You can have. Yeah. So that's kind of
that's very old school. Yeah. So that was introduced in macOS 8. Desktop backgrounds was another new feature. This is funny to think about, but you could only have these tiny like tile backgrounds, and now obviously you assume you can have a picture on your whole desktop, but that used to use a lot of memory, and so it was something that was only added in 1997. Support for Apple file sharing over IP was new as well. And finally, all the kind of remaining bits of macOS were made native to PowerPC. This is pretty incredible, but stuff like QuickDraw and AppleScript, which are really quite core technologies, were still running under emulation. That situation had gone on for years because the Power Mac came out in 1994. It wasn't until 1997 with macOS 8 that finally macOS became fully PowerPC native. There was one huge step forward, which was HFS Plus. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, it's a file system.
Yeah, exactly. And that file system, HFS Plus, was introduced with macOS 8. It was one component of Copeland that they were able to salvage. And it was hugely important. It actually lasted 20 years. It wasn't until 2017 that they replaced HFS Plus with the Apple file system.
Yeah.
Something that I'm kind of fond of, it was a bit quirky looking at it now, is do you remember Sherlock?
Yeah, Sherlock was like a little assistant. Wait, but was that in System 8?
Yeah, a macOS 8, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, it was a little thing that would let you find stuff on your computer.
Yeah, it was replaced eventually by Spotlight. Now when we say that an app was Sherlocked, it's when a third-party developer has an app, and then Apple makes a similar app and bundles it for free, thus destroying the indie developer's business. And that term to Sherlock something comes from this app that Apple developed, Sherlock, because there was an indie app called Watson, which did the same thing.
Sherlock worked locally, and then Watson came along and integrated a whole bunch of internet stuff into it. So you could also search the internet as well as locally and it would put all your web searches into a nice local kind of interface.
We should actually do a show on Sherlocking. I think it would be interesting to go through the whole history of things that have been Sherlocked.
Let's do that one next.
Okay, yeah, let's do that next. That'll be a good one. So there were lots of cool features. Steve Jobs had picked the best bits of Copeland that could be salvaged and added them to macOS 8. And what it did was it bought Apple the time they needed until they could make the migration to macOS 10. And it worked so incredibly well. It was a year later in 98 that the first iMac came out, and that was running System 8 at the time. And Apple never looked back from that point. But to me, what I see here, which was really smart in what Steve Jobs did, was the combination of huge, ambitious vision with some serious pragmatism as well. Mm-hmm. If anything, I think his vision for macOS 10 was grander than anything Copeland or Pink with Taligent had considered. This was Mac running on a proper version of Unix. It had that amazing Aqua user interface. We could do a whole separate episode on Aqua.
An episode on lickability.
Yeah. And it ran classic macOS apps in the classic environment as well. It could run Java apps natively, and they introduced a whole new object-oriented programming language with Objective-C. And, there was so much under the hood in macOS 10 that was awesome. So it was an incredibly ambitious vision. But Steve Jobs knew that he needed to buy his team some time to get there. I think people often remember Steve Jobs as the uncompromising visionary who always said, make it great. Mm-hmm. But what he also did often, actually, if you look at Apple's history, was things like macOS 8, which was not great. In fact, it was so not great that he didn't use it himself, right? It was a pragmatic way of buying time. And he was still, he owned it when it came out and sold 1.2 million copies in 2 weeks. Then he was crowing about it at Macworld Boston for sure. But it was necessary, and it was supremely pragmatic. And it was also throwing scraps to the fan base because, we wanted this and we got it and we paid for it and we were really happy. Even though it sucked, it was literally better than nothing. And
it's all you're going to get.
Yeah. And so a better than nothing story that was a triumphant success is what I wanted to share with you today, because it's not something that you necessarily associate with Steve Jobs. But I do think you can see it even today is like quite a core part of Apple's game plan. One of the things I notice with almost every keynote, there are some people moaning because the changes seem so incremental. Mm-hmm. And they are, I think Apple is always working on this sort of twin track model of steady incremental improvements, and every so often like a giant leap forward as well, or a whole new platform. And those steady incremental steps forward are often very pragmatic. And that pattern, I think you can see, is a mold that Steve Jobs established immediately on his arrival. His first big product release, something a bit shit, but better than nothing, but a smash hit. And that was macOS 8. What do you think?
Also, yeah. I think that also happened with the iPhone, when he kind of demonstrated it in its in a state where all of the software engineers were terrified that it was going to just not work because it was barely working. When he first did that excellent keynote showing off the iPhone, and then also with the Vision Pro, that is not very good. And but it's good enough, I guess. They're going to, if they keep working on it. I mean, it might go all touch bar, but I doubt it. I think they're going to keep cracking at this one for a while.
Well, that's interesting. When you talk about Vision Pro, to me, that's more like macOS 10 than it is like macOS 8. And the reason is because, yes, both of them are a bit shit in a way, but it's interesting the first version of macOS 10 was a bit shit too.
That's true.
And, what Steve Jobs recognized he had to do in order to actually get macOS 10 out of the door was to accept that it wouldn't have feature parity with the classic macOS. Mm-hmm. There would be some things missing. That's where we were talking before about lean, agile, and a minimum viable product. macOS 10 wasn't everything that macOS was, but it was enough to ship. And it was better to ship something and build on it than never ship and not get those learnings, spend a lot of time building things that maybe users didn't need, or building a product that was going out of date before it was even released. To me, with Vision Pro, I think that they decided that that was their minimum viable product. It has lots of things missing, but if they kept it under wraps and kept developing it any longer, it would just become a Death March project and never get released. And so it was better to get something out there and start getting the learnings. And one of the things, that's very much the agile modern project management methodology, is get something to market sooner and learn from it.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's out there and it's going to get better. I mean, it can only get better and hopefully cheaper.
So that's today's episode. And what did we learn? Well, I think before Steve Jobs' return, Apple had become so obsessed with focusing on what they couldn't do, releasing a next-generation operating system, that they lost sight of what they could do, which was to make big improvements to their current operating system. It took the return of Steve Jobs to figure out that there was loads of cool stuff in Copeland that could be salvaged to keep the classic macOS on life support for just long enough for macOS 10 to come onto the scene. And I think what the story tells us is that Jobs wasn't just an idealist and a perfectionist. He could also be a pragmatist. And that reminded me of this quote from Jobs. In a product demo for iWeb, he once posted a fake resume. In it, he said, "I'm looking for a fixer-upper with a solid foundation. I'm willing to tear down walls, build bridges, and light fires. I have great experience, lots of energy, and a bit of that vision thing, and I'm not afraid to start from the beginning." If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Apple Core, the Apple History podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're feeling especially generous, you could give us a review too. It really helps with our visibility. That's it for now, so until next time, bye-bye.